First, say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. Yesterday, I read a quote from Epictetus, and I thought about how it might apply in the real world. I interpret it to mean that you must identify what your goal is, and then take steps to achieve that goal. It makes sense. You can't hit a target that you're unaware of. You can't hit a target you can't see. So you have to set up your targets and then work backwards from those targets so you can nail them. I mean, that's pretty obvious. You're at the range, you can't hit a target if it's not visible, or if you don't know where it is. So applying this to aviation, your first solo might be a good target. It's tangible. I want to fly by myself. How do you get there? Well, 14 CFR Part 61.87 outlines exactly what you need to do to go solo. There are 15 items, last time I checked, that cover everything from pre-flight preparations to emergency procedures that the pilot is expected to know before he's able to fly an airplane by himself. On top of those requirements, of course, there's the legal requirements such as getting a medical, obtaining your student pilot certificate, and if you're at an airfield that's controlled or has a higher security, obtaining a badge to get onto the field. But if you create a checklist for everything, or create a checklist for a certain action, you can just go down the line and knock out every item on the checklist, and once that checklist is complete, you know you're ready to go do the thing. In this case, go solo. With that being said, yesterday, both of my pilots were pre-solo, so we went out to work on those 15 items. Every time we fly, we want to have a flight plan out to a specific practice area or airport, have a specific set of maneuvers we're going to go work on or polish, and have a specific route in mind for how to get home. In addition to that, we need to have an alternate in the event that the Russians take out our home field or something. That's a joke, by the way. First, we departed from Payne Field and planned to climb up to a cruise altitude of 3,000 feet. I like 3,000 because it's high enough to get you away from terrain, but low enough to where you're not climbing for the entire flight. We calculated our best rate of climb using the pilot operating handbook and determined our true course, wind correction, ground speed, and fuel burn for our climb and cruise to Arlington. We allotted 30 minutes of maximum power for our maneuvering. For flight number 1, we're going to be doing the traffic pattern, and flight number 2, we plan to polish the private pilot level maneuvers. In both cases, we plan for a return to Payne using a specific route. Let's talk about indicated versus calibrated versus true airspeed. Indicated airspeed is exactly what it sounds like. It is the airspeed read off your airspeed indicator. The instrument measures ram air going into the pitot tube and compares it to the static air provided by the static port on the side of the aircraft. At certain angles of attack, there is some error induced into your airspeed because the pitot tube is not pointed directly into the relative wind. We account for this error by using the calibrated airspeed table in the pilot operating handbook. In the aircraft that we're flying yesterday, there's about a 3 mile per hour difference between indicated and calibrated airspeed. We can then convert from miles per hour to knots using the E6B or applying the appropriate conversion factor. From there, we are in calibrated airspeed in nautical miles per hour, and we can account for the non-standard air pressure and temperature using the altimeter setting and the temperature at the airfield during the time we fly. The calculation for a good estimate of your pressure altitude is the standard pressure altitude setting of 29.92 inches of mercury minus the current altimeter setting multiplied by 1,000. This is called your pressure altitude conversion factor, and we add that to the field elevation to determine our pressure altitude. We can then correct for density altitude using the temperature at the field in Celsius and placing that across from our air pressure or our pressure altitude on the E6B. Again, this is our density altitude, which is the altitude the airplane feels like it's flying. The density altitude, by definition, is the pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. Once we have this dialed into the E6B, we can find the calibrated airspeed on the inner scale and read the true airspeed on the outer scale. The true airspeed is calibrated airspeed corrected for non-standard temperature and is the speed of the aircraft relative to the air. Next, we calculate our ground speed, which is the speed of the aircraft over the ground. This will be affected by wind direction and velocity. In general, ground speed increases with a tailwind and decreases with a headwind. We'll also need to adjust for any crosswind to avoid drifting off course. This is something that's probably easier done using the actual computer and having a visual reference, so we'll save this for a later discussion. Once we determine our flight plan, and again that's a departure point, a top of climb at least to one waypoint to indicate when we begin our maneuver phase, a certain amount of time and fuel for maneuvering, a return waypoint, and a top of descent to the field. Now we can start talking about the maneuvers we're going to fly. The Airman Certification Standard specifies what maneuvers you are required to learn and demonstrate on your check ride to become a pilot. Let's take a look at the performance maneuvers and ground reference maneuvers. It's pretty simple at the private pilot level. For the performance maneuver, you must demonstrate a steep turn. That is a 45-degree bank for a full 360 degrees, return to level flight, and perform the maneuver in the opposite direction for another 360-degree turn. The ACS specifies that you must complete this within plus or minus 100 feet, plus or minus 10 knots, and plus or minus 5 degrees of bank, and return to your initial heading within plus or minus 10 degrees. This will test your ability to control the aircraft at steep angles of bank when the plane wants to continue over banking. And because we lose a significant amount of vertical lift in the steep turn, the plane will start to sink. So you have to demonstrate your ability to hold the aircraft at a specific altitude at a high angle of bank without bleeding off too much energy. It's a fun maneuver because you start to feel a little bit of G. Speaking of which, you'll have to understand load factor. Now, load factor is the ratio of the load carried by the wings to the actual weight of the aircraft. We refer to load factor in terms of G. So if you ever hear a pilot talking about how they're pulling a 9G turn, that's talking about the load factor, or the load that the aircraft is carrying. The steeper the angle of bank, the greater the load factor becomes. And it's not linear, it's actually exponential. When studying for your maneuvers before a flight, I recommend using the maneuver worksheet that I created that lists the following sections: the name of the maneuver, the objective of the maneuver as stated in the Airplane Flying Handbook, a sketch of the maneuver, which doesn't have to be perfect, just enough to get the point across, the standard as stated in the ACS guidelines, common errors from the Airplane Flying Handbook, and any notes you might have for yourself, such as when executing a steep turn, I recommend using about 4 or 5 turns of the trim wheel to account for the loss of vertical lift. For any given flight, I recommend selecting maybe 4 maneuvers to tighten up. This should give you enough time to make a maneuver worksheet for each maneuver, chair fly them before the flight, and you'll have enough time to actually drill those maneuvers while you're out flying. What you don't want to happen is to show up at the airfield and not have a clue as to what you're doing for the day. Before you leave for the day after a flight, you should already know what you need to work on, what maneuvers you want to drill, and when you're going to be flying next. Have this locked in and you'll have everything you need to make a solid flight plan. What I like about the way I structure my plans is that every flight has a little bit of everything that goes into being a pilot. We have our pre-flight calculations and weather. Of course, we need our 91.103 items. I use the acronym Northwest Craft. That stands for notices to air missions, weather, known delays, runways, alternates, fuel, and takeoff and landing distances. If nothing else, this should be ready to roll for every flight. Next, this structure includes flight planning and navigation. We use redundant forms of navigation when we fly, including pilotage, dead reckoning, VOR navigation, and GPS if the aircraft is equipped. We practice good situational awareness while we fly out to a specific practice area. Once there, we know exactly what maneuvers we're going to drill, and we have them outlined using those maneuver worksheets. I like to include a little bit of everything in the maneuver phase, including ground reference maneuvers, high altitude maneuvers or performance maneuvers such as steep turns and slow flight installs, emergency procedures, and flight under simulated instrument conditions. Something else that I like to do during my flights is to review an emergency procedure right before or right after changing the phase of flight. For example, if we're about to start the aircraft, we run through the pre-flight procedure or the pre-flight checklist and the before engine start checklist. Right before we start the engine, we go to the back side of the checklist and review the engine fire during the startup sequence. That way, it's fresh in our mind. We get up to the runway right before takeoff. We review the engine failure during takeoff procedure and make a contingency plan for engine failure during takeoff, during climb out, and at altitude. Once we're cruising, we'll review another emergency procedure, including things like engine fires at altitude, electrical fires, or electrical failures. Now, we don't actually want to do everything on the checklist because pulling the mix to idle will starve the engine. But what we do is we touch every component that the checklist says to actuate so that we know where everything is. For example, we run through the engine fire checklist: mixture idle cutoff, fuel shutoff valve off, master switch off, ignition switch off, pitch for 100 miles per hour to extinguish the flames, and do not restart the engine. Of course, we don't actually do that. We just touch everything and run through the flow. Now, throughout the entire flight, you should be monitoring your fuel level. One way I like to track fuel is to set a timer right at engine start. One timer counts up for the amount of time we've been running the engine, and another timer counts down for the fuel remaining. For example, if I have 3 hours of fuel on board by my calculations, and I have allotted only 1 hour of actual flight time, including taxi, takeoff, climb, cruise, and whatever, I will set a 1 hour timer for that allotted fuel so that I know that I should be on the ground by the time that timer goes off. And if I'm not on the ground, that I should be making every possible decision to get back home. Some aircraft will actually show you how much fuel remaining, such as the EDM 900, but you should always dip your tanks, calculate your fuel, and include your own personal mins on top of your legally required mins. At the end of the flight, you should get out and dip the tanks to see how close you were to your calculations. Okay, so we reviewed our flight planning, 91.103 items, takeoff, climb, cruise, maneuvering, and return. I know it seems like a lot, but if you wait until you're getting ready to solo to start planning your flights, that's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. If you start from day one and just struggle with the material, the more you do it and the earlier you start, the better you'll understand this stuff, and you'll be able to make flight plans really easily by the time you're ready to go do it by yourself. There's a reason why I can make a flight plan in 5 minutes. It's because I do it 5 times a day. I remember I was in college and I was struggling with calculus. I think it was Calc 2. And I asked the professor, what question should I do in the back of the book to prepare for the exam? And he looked at me kind of funny and he said, all of them. At the time, I was a little annoyed, like, what do you mean all of them? But now I get it. You need to practice so much that it would be unreasonable not to be good at it. I think it's Alex Hormozy that says something along those lines. Do something for so long and get as many reps as possible that it would be unreasonable for you to not be good at it. Anyways, if you're interested in becoming not just a better pilot, but a better person, click here to watch a video about our core values. My name is Monty. I'm a pilot and a CFI. And if you're listening to this, you are the squadron.